In 1800, Washington barely existed in the American imagination. It wasn't a place of power, wealth, or ambition. It was a distant edge of the map, marked more by blank space than by cities. To most Americans, Washington was a cold, rain-soaked wilderness at the far end of the continent, separated from the nation's political and economic centers by mountains, deserts, and months of dangerous travel. There were no skylines, no factories, no global trade routes pointing west toward the Pacific. Just forests so dense they seemed endless, rivers so wild they appeared untamable, and coastlines that felt more like barriers than opportunities. Few believed this land would ever matter. At the dawn of the 19th century, America's economic power lived elsewhere along the Atlantic coast. In cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, wealth moved east to west, not the other way around. The idea that prosperity could rise from the far Pacific Northwest felt unrealistic, even absurd. Washington was dismissed as too remote, too rugged, too disconnected from the real engines of progress. It was seen as a place people passed through, not a place where history was made. And yet, just 1 century later, that perception had been completely shattered. By 1900, Washington was no longer silent wilderness. Towering forests had been transformed into industrial lifelines. Quiet shorelines had become crowded ports filled with ships carrying timber, coal, fish, and grain to markets across the nation and beyond. Rivers once feared for their power were now celebrated for it driving commerce, shaping cities, and hinting at an industrial future no one had imagined in 1800. Small settlements had grown into bustling urban centers. Railroads stitched the region into the national economy. Money flowed, people arrived, influence expanded. So how did this happen? How did a place written off as a soggy frontier become one of the most economically strategic regions in American history? How did isolation turn into advantage? How did geography once seen as an obstacle become the very engine of growth? And why is this transformation so rarely taught, despite its lasting impact on the nation's economy? This is not a story of sudden miracles or accidental success. It's a story of timing, ambition, and a deep understanding of land and location. A story of resources that didn't just exist, but were organized, transported, and leveraged at exactly the right moment in history. It's about ports that faced the future, while the rest of the country still looked east. About rivers that promised power long before electricity reshaped the world. About a region that quietly positioned itself for dominance while others underestimated it. In this video, you'll see Washington not as a remote edge of America, but as a turning point where geography met opportunity, and a forgotten land reshaped the nation's economic future. This is the story schools rarely tell, and once you see it, you'll never look at the map the same way again. At the start of the 19th century, Washington was defined not by power, but by distance. It sat at the far western edge of the continent, cut off from the centers of American decision-making by sheer geography. To the east rose towering mountain ranges that slowed travel to a crawl. To the west stretched the vast Pacific Ocean mistress, unpredictable and largely disconnected from the young nation's economic priorities. Between Washington and cities like New York or Philadelphia lay thousands of miles of wilderness. News traveled slowly. Goods traveled even slower. In an era when proximity meant influence, Washington seemed destined to remain on the margins. This isolation shaped how Americans viewed the region. Washington was not seen as a place of opportunity, but as a logistical problem. Harsh weather, dense forests, and rugged terrain reinforced the belief that this land was more burden than benefit. Settlement was sparse, infrastructure was minimal. From the outside, there appeared to be little reason for capital, industry, or ambition to flow so far west. Power, after all, was supposed to grow outward from established centers, not emerge from the edge of the map. But hidden within this isolation were advantages no one fully understood yet. Washington possessed deep natural harbors carved by ancient glaciers, especially along Puget Sound, where calm, protected waters offered some of the finest port conditions on the entire west coast. Its forests were vast beyond imagination, and stands of timber that could supply construction, shipbuilding, and railroads for generations. And its rivers, including the immense Columbia River, flowed with relentless force, carrying not just water, but the promise of transportation, trade, and future power. These were not small advantages. They were structural advantages, ones that could reshape economies if properly understood. Long before American settlers arrived, indigenous peoples had already recognized this potential. Trade networks stretched across the region, connecting coastal communities with inland tribes through rivers, trails, and exchange systems refined over centuries. Fish, tools, timber, and goods moved efficiently through these routes, proving that Washington was never truly isolated, was simply isolated from American awareness. Economic activity did not begin with statehood or railroads. It was inherited, adapted, and expanded upon. The land already knew how to support commerce. What changed was who controlled it and how it was scaled. As the early 1800s unfolded, Washington stood quietly at a crossroads of possibility. Its resources remained largely untouched, its geography misunderstood, its strategic position overlooked. Yet the very features that seemed to hold it back, distance, wilderness, separation, were the same features that would soon propel it forward. Because Washington's greatest strength was never just what it could produce, it was where it sat in the world and what that position would soon make possible. In the 19th century, geography was not a backdrop to history, was one of its most decisive forces, and in that sense, Washington was quietly holding a winning hand long before anyone realized the game had changed. While most Americans still measured power by distance to the Atlantic, Washington was already facing the future. It sat on the Pacific Rim, closer to Asia than any other part of the continental United States, positioned along trade routes that would one day define global commerce. In the early 1800s, this meant very little to a nation still looking east. But as the century unfolded, this location would become one of the most important economic advantages in American history. At the heart of that advantage was Puget Sound, a vast, sheltered network of deep-water inlets carved by glaciers thousands of years earlier. Unlike much of the West Coast, Puget Sound offered calm waters, natural protection from storms, and dozens of anchorages suitable for large ships. Even more critical, these ports were ice-free year-round, while harbors in the northeast froze during harsh winters, disrupting trade and raising costs. Ships in Puget Sound could load and unload cargo in every season. Time saved meant money saved, reliability meant trust, and trust attracted trade. This single geographic feature reshaped Washington's economic destiny. Goods could move faster and more safely than through many competing ports. Timber, fish, coal, and agricultural products could be exported efficiently, while manufactured goods and immigrants arrived just as easily. Over time, Puget Sound didn't just connect Washington to the rest of the United States, it connected America to the Pacific world. Long before globalization entered the vocabulary, Washington was positioned to benefit from it. But geography's influence didn't stop at the coast. Washington's rivers acted like natural highways cutting through rugged terrain. Instead of blocking movement, waterways guided it, linking inland regions to ports and markets. Rivers carried logs downstream to mills, crops to shipping centers, and people toward opportunity. They shaped settlement patterns, determining where towns would rise and where industry would concentrate. What looked like untamed wilderness to outsiders functioned as a carefully structured system of movement and exchange. The mountains played a similar role. The Cascade Range divided the state into distinct economic zones, each shaped by its environment. West of the mountains, heavy rainfall supported dense forests and maritime industries. East of them, drier lands encouraged agriculture, mining, and inland trade. Rather than fragmenting the economy, this division diversified it. Washington didn't rely on a single resource or industry. It developed complementary systems that fed into one another, raw materials from one region, processing and export from another. Even the forests themselves were not obstacles, but assets waiting for organization. They dictated where rail lines would run, where mills would be built, and where labor would gather. Logging camps became towns, towns became cities, and cities became nodes in a growing economic network. Geography determined not only what Washington produced, but how efficiently it could move those products to market. What made this especially powerful was timing. Washington's geographic advantages matured just as technology caught up to them. Steamships reduced dependence on wind, railroads overcame mountain barriers, industrial demand for lumber, minerals, and agricultural products exploded nationwide. Suddenly, the features that once made Washington feel distant made it indispensable. Its ports faced outward toward emerging markets. Its rivers supported scale. Its land supported growth. This is why Washington's rise was not accidental. It wasn't simply lucky to have forests or rivers many regions did. What set it apart was how those features worked together as a system. The landscape directed economic behavior. funneled investment, and rewarded long-term planning. Geography didn't resist progress, it shaped it. By the late 1800s, Washington was no longer adapting to the nation's economy, it was influencing it. Trade routes shifted, capital followed geography, and a state once dismissed as remote became strategically essential. In this story, geography was not scenery to be admired, it was strategy to be leveraged. And Washington leveraged it better than almost anyone else. By the middle of the 19th century, the true engine of Washington's economic rise was standing tall all around it, its forests. Dense, ancient, and seemingly endless, Washington's timber was unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. Towering Douglas firs and cedar trees rose hundreds of feet into the sky, straight, strong, and perfectly suited for construction. At a time when the United States was expanding westward at a breathtaking pace, these forests became indispensable. Cities were growing, railroads were spreading, ships were multiplying, and all of it required wood, vast amounts of it. Across the American West, fires routinely destroyed entire towns built quickly and cheaply from timber. Each disaster created immediate demand for rebuilding, and Washington answered that demand again and again. Its lumber traveled south to California, east to the interior, and overseas across the Pacific. Railroads needed ties and bridges, ships needed hulls and masts. Homes, warehouses, docks, and factories all depended on wood. Timber was not a regional commodity, it was a national necessity, and Washington possessed it in unmatched quantity and quality. What began as small-scale logging operations soon transformed into an organized industry. Early logging camps were rough and temporary, carved directly into the forest, with little thought of permanence. Workers followed the trees, cutting, hauling, and floating logs down rivers toward sawmills. But as demand increased, these camps began to stabilize. Roads were built, equipment improved, families followed workers, schools, stores, and churches appeared. Temporary camps slowly evolved into permanent towns, rooted not in farmland or politics, but in trees. At the center of this transformation stood sawmills. These were the true engines of wealth, converting raw timber into standardized lumber that could be sold, shipped, and scaled. Mills multiplied along rivers and coastlines, especially near natural harbors, where finished boards could be loaded directly onto ships. Each mill represented more than production, it represented investment, labor, and connection to distant markets. Timber stopped being just something cut from the land. It became capital. No city embodied this shift more clearly than Seattle. In its earliest years, Seattle was little more than a rough settlement surrounded by forest. Dirt paths wound between wooden buildings. The economy was small, local, and uncertain. But as logging intensified, Seattle's location turned it into a gateway between forest and ocean. Trees cut inland flowed toward its mills and docks. Ships arrived empty and left heavy with lumber bound for California, Hawaii, and beyond. As the timber trade expanded, Seattle transformed rapidly. Dirt paths gave way to streets. Wharves extended into deep water. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Money began to circulate, attracting banks, merchants, and investors. Lumber profits didn't just enrich mill owners, they funded infrastructure, shipping companies, and urban growth. Seattle became a place where timber wealth concentrated, multiplied, and reinvested itself. Timber also shaped the workforce and social structure of Washington. Logging demanded labor hard, dangerous, and relentless. Thousands of workers were drawn to the region, creating a steady flow of population growth. This influx fueled demand for food, housing, transportation, and services, further diversifying the economy. What started as a single dominant industry created ripple effects across every sector of life. Timber paid wages. Wages built communities. Communities demanded more industry. Crucially, timber linked Washington to national and international markets earlier than many other western regions. Lumber was heavy and expensive to transport, which made proximity to ports essential. Washington's coastal geography reduced costs and increased competitiveness. This allowed the state to undercut rivals and dominate supply routes. Timber exports brought cash into the region, turning natural resources into financial leverage. That capital would later fund railroads, urban development, and industrial experimentation. Over time, timber's influence extended beyond economics into identity. Washington became known as a place of production and reliability, a region that could deliver essential materials at scale. This reputation mattered. It attracted long-term investment rather than speculative settlement. Businesses saw Washington not as a gamble, but as a foundation. Timber stabilized the economy in its early stages and gave it credibility in the eyes of the nation. Most importantly, timber created the base upon which everything else was built. Railroads followed logging routes. Ports expanded to handle lumber shipments. Cities grew where mills clustered. Even future industries, manufacturing, shipping, and eventually heavy industry, relied on infrastructure first paid for by timber wealth. When Washington later diversified its economy, it did so from a position of strength created by forests. By the late 1800s, timber was no longer the only industry in Washington, but it remained the most important historically. It transformed wilderness into towns, resources into capital, and isolation into connection. Without timber, there would have been no rapid urban growth, no dominant ports, and no economic momentum to build upon. Timber wasn't just an industry, it was the foundation on which Washington's economic power was constructed on. Everything that followed rose from its roots. East of the mountains, the story of Washington changed dramatically. For decades, the Cascade Range had acted as both a physical and economic barrier, separating the resource-rich interior from coastal ports and national markets. Travel across these mountains was slow, dangerous, and expensive. Wagons struggled through narrow passes, goods spoiled or were abandoned. Entire regions remained economically isolated, not because they lacked value, but because they lacked access. In the early 1800s, this isolation defined eastern Washington as firmly as forests defined the West. Railroads changed everything. When rail lines finally crossed the Cascades in the late 19th century, the transformation was almost immediate. What had once taken weeks or months by wagon or river could now be done in days. Distance collapsed. Isolation vanished. Eastern Washington was no longer cut off from capital, labor, or markets. Railroads did more than move goods, they redefined what was economically possible. Suddenly, land that had been marginal became profitable. Resources that had been trapped became mobile. And towns that barely existed became strategic hubs. No place illustrates this shift more clearly than Spokane. Before the railroads, Spokane was a modest settlement near powerful waterfalls on the Spokane River. Its location offered energy and water, but little connection to the wider economy. With the arrival of railroads, that changed almost overnight. Spokane became a crossroads linking mining districts to the east, agricultural lands to the south, and ports to the west. It didn't merely grow, it organized the interior economy. Mining was one of the first industries transformed. Eastern Washington and nearby regions were rich in minerals, but extraction alone meant little without transportation. Rail access allowed, or to be moved efficiently to smelters and markets. This turned mining from a risky, localized activity into a structured industry with supply chains, investment, and long-term planning. Railroads reduced costs, stabilized output, and attracted capital. What had once been boom and bust, prospecting became a dependable economic sector. Agriculture followed a similar path. Eastern Washington's dry climate and fertile soil were ideal for wheat and other crops, but farmers had struggled to profit when transportation was unreliable. Railroads changed that equation. Grain could now move quickly to ports and national markets, without spoilage or prohibitive cost. Farming shifted from subsistence to commercial scale. Large harvests became economically viable. Rural communities gained stability, and agriculture became a pillar of the state's economy rather than a local necessity. Railroads also reshaped settlement patterns. Towns grew where rail lines intersected, where depots were built, and where goods could be exchanged. These towns became service centers supplying equipment, processing products, and connecting producers to buyers. Small communities were no longer isolated pockets. They were links in a larger economic chain. Each stop on the rail line mattered. Each connection strengthened the system. Crucially, railroads unified Washington's economy. The coast and the interior were no longer separate worlds. Timber from the west could move east. Grain from the east could move west. Ports handled exports. Cities handled finance. Rural areas handled production. This integration reduced dependency on any single region or resource. Washington began to function as a coordinated economic organism rather than a collection of disconnected frontiers. Rail access also changed perception. Investors who once saw Eastern Washington as too distant or uncertain now saw opportunity. Land values rose, infrastructure expanded. Schools, factories, and institutions followed. Economic confidence replaced speculation. Railroads signaled permanence and assurance that communities were connected to the future, not stranded in the past. By the late 1800s, the effects were unmistakable. Spokane emerged as one of the largest cities in the Pacific Northwest, not because it controlled resources directly, but because it controlled movement. It managed flow of goods, people, and capital. That role made it indispensable. Similar patterns played out across eastern Washington, where rail-connected towns anchored local economies and fed into the state's broader growth. This was the moment Washington stopped being a frontier. Frontiers are defined by isolation, uncertainty, and self-contained survival. Railroads erased those conditions. They tied Washington to national systems of production and trade. They allowed specialization, scale, and efficiency. They turned potential into performance. By linking farms, mines, towns, cities, and ports, railroads completed Washington's economic transformation. The state no longer depended on a single coast or industry. It operated as an integrated economic system, flexible, diversified, and resilient. What geography had once divided, railroads unified. And in doing so, they pushed Washington firmly into the ranks of America's most strategically important economic regions by the end of the 19th century. By the late 19th century, leaders, engineers, and entrepreneurs in Washington were beginning to see rivers differently. For decades, waterways had been treated primarily as routes paths to float logs, move crops, and reach ports. But a quieter realization was taking hold. Rivers were not just corridors of movement, they were reservoirs of power, and no river embodied that future more clearly than the Columbia River. The Columbia was immense, wide, fast, and relentless. It cut through mountains, crossed borders, and drained a vast interior basin. Its seasonal surges carried extraordinary force, a natural energy that could be felt long before it could be fully measured. Early on, settlers relied on the river for transport and trade, floating timber downstream and moving goods between inland farms and coastal ports. But as industry expanded and technology advanced, the river's movement suggested something more profound. Flow could be converted, motion could become energy, and energy, in the modern age, meant economic power. Even before the era of massive dams, Washington experimented with river-driven industry. Water wheels and small-scale hydro projects powered mills, processing plants, and local manufacturing. These early efforts were modest, but they proved a critical point. Power drawn from water was reliable, cheap, and renewable. Unlike coal or wood fuel, rivers did not need to be mined or transported. They worked continuously, day and night, season after season. For industrial planners, this stability was revolutionary. This realization arrived at exactly the right moment. Across the United States, electricity was beginning to reshape economic life. Factories no longer had to cluster around coalfields. Production could be scaled. Machinery could run faster, longer, and more efficiently. States that could provide abundant power at low cost gained a decisive advantage. Washington recognized this earlier than most, not because it was more technologically advanced, but because its geography made the potential impossible to ignore. Engineers surveyed river corridors, politicians debated navigation improvements, investors studied water flow and elevation drops. Each conversation pointed toward the same conclusion. Washington's rivers could support industrial growth on a scale few other states could match. The Columbia, in particular, offered something rare: volume combined with consistency. This was not a small regional stream. It was a continental system capable of sustaining large energy-intensive industries. What made this especially significant was how it aligned with Washington's existing economy. Timber processing, mining support, agriculture, and transportation all demanded power. As those sectors expanded, energy costs threatened to limit growth. Hydropower promised the opposite: lower costs as scale increased. Cheap electricity meant competitive advantage. It meant attracting industries that would otherwise settle elsewhere. It meant turning natural geography into long-term leverage. Just as important, this power vision was forward-looking. Washington was not simply responding to immediate demand. It was planning for an industrial future that had not fully arrived yet. While other regions relied on finite resources, Washington invested in systems that could expand indefinitely. Rivers renewed themselves. Power regenerated. The state was positioning itself, not just for the present economy, but for the next one. Transportation and power also reinforced each other. Improvements made to rivers for navigation channels, locks, and flow controller fan supported energy generation. Economic planners began to think in systems: how water could move goods and generate power at the same time, how infrastructure could serve multiple purposes, how long-term efficiency could outweigh short-term cost. This systems thinking placed Washington ahead of many older industrial states, still tied to 18th-century energy models. By the end of the 1800s, the blueprint was clear even if the largest projects were still decades away. Washington understood that industrial dominance in the modern age would depend on energy more than raw materials alone. Timber could be exhausted, mines could run dry, but rivers, properly managed, offered enduring strength. The groundwork had been laid in surveys, in engineering studies, in political will for a transformation that would fully unfold in the 20th century. This early understanding mattered. When heavy industry expanded nationally, Washington was ready. When electricity became the backbone of manufacturing, Washington already had the advantage mapped out. When energy-intensive sectors looked for places to grow, Washington could offer what others could not: abundant power tied directly to ports, railroads, and resources. In hindsight, the Columbia River was never just a river. It was a promise, a signal that geography could fuel industry without depletion, that power could be drawn from nature without destroying it, that economic leadership could be built not only on what a state extracted, but on how intelligently it used what it already had. By recognizing rivers as engines of power rather than obstacles to cross, Washington positioned itself ahead of its time. Even before concrete dams rose across the landscape, the strategy was set. The state had learned to see motion as energy, geography as opportunity, and rivers as the foundation of an industrial future that would soon place Washington among America's most powerful economic regions. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Washington had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer defined solely by what it could extract from the land. Timber, wheat, fish, and minerals still mattered, but something more important had emerged. Washington had learned how to connect those resources. Ports moved them outward, railroads moved them inward, rivers powered their transformation, cities organized their exchange. What had once been a resource frontier was becoming a coordinated economic system, and that shift changed Washington's role in the nation entirely. At the center of this transformation were Washington's ports, no longer just shipping points for raw lumber. They became gateways through which the American economy reached the Pacific world. Finished lumber, processed goods, agricultural surpluses, and industrial materials flowed outward, while machinery, capital, and people flowed inward. Trade was no longer incidental. It was strategic. Shipping routes adjusted to Washington's geography, not the other way around. In doing so, the state began shaping how America interacted with global markets, rather than simply reacting to them. Railroads completed this picture. They linked interior farms and mining regions directly to ports, turning inland production into coastal power. Wheat fields hundreds of miles from the ocean became part of international trade. Mining output fed manufacturing, timber fed construction nationwide. The key change was scale. Washington was no longer producing for local or regional needs. It was producing for national and international demand. That scale attracted investment, and investment changed everything. Capital followed coordination. Investors were drawn not just to resources, but to systems that made those resources reliable and profitable. Washington offered predictability, stable transportation, expanding infrastructure, and growing urban centers capable of supporting finance, labor, and innovation. Banks multiplied, shipping firms expanded, insurance, warehousing, and manufacturing followed. Money stopped passing through Washington briefly and began staying reinvested into roads, docks, factories, and neighborhoods. This economic confidence fueled immigration. Workers arrived from other states and from overseas, drawn by opportunity rather than desperation. Cities expanded rapidly, absorbing newcomers into a diversifying economy. Seattle grew from a lumber town into a commercial and financial center, where shipping schedules, trade contracts, and industrial planning shaped daily life. Spokane, inland but essential, coordinated agriculture, mining, and manufacturing across the eastern half of the state. Together, these cities anchored Washington's economy at both ends, coast and interior, binding it into a single functional whole. Agriculture, once limited by distance, became a national force. Rail access and port connectivity meant Washington farmers could compete far beyond regional markets. Grain prices stabilized, production increased. Rural wealth grew alongside urban wealth. reducing economic imbalance and reinforcing political influence. Farming was no longer a gamble against geography. It was a calculated enterprise within a larger system. Energy completed the transition. Early hydropower projects and river-driven industry kept costs low and productivity high. This mattered enormously as America moved toward heavier industry. States that relied on expensive fuel struggled to scale. Washington did not. Cheap, abundant power allowed expansion without the same constraints faced elsewhere. This advantage was not accidental, it was the result of decades of recognizing geography as leverage. By 1900, Washington's influence extended beyond its borders. Trade routes adjusted to its ports. Rail schedules depended on its output. National industries relied on its materials and logistics. Washington was no longer catching up to the rest of the country, was helping set the pace. Its economy was diversified, integrated, and resilient. Timber no longer stood alone. Agriculture, shipping, manufacturing, finance, and energy reinforced one another. Perhaps most important was what this foundation made possible. The systems built in the 1800s, ports, rail corridors, power networks, skilled labor pools, were adaptable. They could support industries that did not yet exist. When the 20th century demanded aircraft, ships, and mass production on an unprecedented scale, Washington was ready. Companies like Boeing would later rise, not by coincidence, but because the infrastructure, workforce, and energy they required had already been quietly assembled. Wartime manufacturing would follow the same pattern. When the nation needed rapid production, efficient logistics, and massive power supply, Washington delivered. The groundwork laid between 1800 and 1900 proved decisive decades later, turning preparation into dominance. By the turn of the century, Washington had completed its transformation. It was no longer defined by isolation, wilderness, or raw extraction. It had become a national player exporting, not just goods, but influence. Its geography shaped trade. Its infrastructure shaped policy. Its economy shaped the future. What began as a distant frontier ended the 19th century as one of the most strategically important economic regions in the United States, poised to shape the modern world that was about to arrive. As the 19th century draws to a close, the story of Washington asks us to slow down and look more carefully at how economic power truly forms. Washington's rise was not sudden, and it was never inevitable. It did not emerge because of a single discovery, a single industry, or a single moment of luck. It emerged because people learned how to see the land differently, how to read geography, not as a limitation, but as a set of instructions. Mountains, rivers, forests, and distance were not obstacles to be overcome at any cost. They were signals, quietly pointing toward what this place could become if approached with patience and strategy. What makes Washington's transformation so remarkable is how early it happened and how far from the nation's traditional centers of power it unfolded. In the 1800s, American economic authority still flowed outward from the Atlantic. Cities in the Northeast shaped finance, manufacturing, and policy. Innovation clustered where institutions already existed. From that perspective, Washington should have remained peripheral for generations. Instead, it rewrote the rules by proving that economic gravity could shift. This shift did not begin with ambition alone. It began with understanding. Washington's leaders, workers, and investors learned how its systems fit together. Timber financed infrastructure. Infrastructure enabled trade. Trade attracted people. People demanded power, transportation, and organization. Rivers supplied energy. Railroads supplied connection. Ports supplied reach. None of these elements worked in isolation. Their power came from coordination, an economy designed as a whole, rather than built in fragments. That lesson still matters. Long before modern technology hubs, long before places like Silicon Valley defined innovation, Washington demonstrated that influence does not require proximity to old power. It requires alignment between geography and timing. In the 1800s, the Pacific world was opening. Global trade routes were shifting. Industrial demand was accelerating. Washington happened to sit at the crossroads of these changes and it chose to act. Equally important is what Washington did not do. It did not exhaust its future for short-term gain. While resources were heavily used, the state also invested in systems that could scale and adapt. Railroads were built not just for immediate profit, but for integration. Power generation was explored not just for present needs, but for industries yet to come. Cities grew around logistics, finance, and coordination, not just extraction. This long view allowed Washington to remain relevant as the economy evolved. By 1900, the results were undeniable. Washington was no longer a place defined by remoteness. It was a place defined by connection. Its ports linked America to the Pacific. Its farms fed distant markets. Its cities organized trade and capital. Its energy potential hinted at industrial leadership. The state had moved from reacting to national trends to helping shape them. This matters today because it challenges how we think about development and power. Too often, history is taught as though success belongs naturally to certain places: coastal capitals, early industrial centers, established elites. Washington's story disrupts that assumption. It shows that economic leadership can emerge from places once ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. It shows that geography does not lock a region into destiny, offers choices. It also reminds us that timing is everything. Washington did not rush blindly into growth. It expanded when transportation made scale possible, when markets demanded supply, and when power could be delivered cheaply and reliably. Opportunity was not chased recklessly. It was seized deliberately. That distinction explains why Washington's growth endured rather than collapsing into boom and bust cycles. Perhaps most striking is how invisible this transformation often feels in popular memory. Washington's later achievements, its aerospace dominance, its wartime manufacturing power, its modern innovation are widely recognized. But the groundwork that made those achievements possible was laid quietly, decades earlier, by loggers, farmers, engineers, dockworkers, railroad builders, and planners who understood that prosperity is built long before it is celebrated. When we look back at Washington in 1800, we see a place written off as distant and inconvenient. When we look again in 1900, we see a state positioned to shape the century ahead. That arc from dismissal to dominance is not just a regional story. It is a lesson in how nations evolve, because Washington's rise forces us to ask a deeper question. How many other places, today or in the past, have been underestimated simply because they sit beyond the spotlight? How many regions labeled remote, secondary, or unlikely are quietly assembling the conditions for future influence? And how often do we fail to recognize power until it has already reshaped the map? History shows us that the future rarely announces itself from the places we expect. Sometimes it grows at the edge patiently, strategically until the center shifts. So as you close this story, consider that question carefully. How many other places were once dismissed as remote, only to reshape the future of a nation?